the genesis of this talk is, when I first proposed this talk, I did not expect it to go in the direction that it went, so it kind of goes in a more provocative direction than I expected it to. This started, I sort of fell my way into doing a little bit of work on animal studies because, as was mentioned, I work on food often, and I ended up getting invited several years ago, because I work on food and particularly the Jews and pork, to a conference at Yale on the pig. So they had pig farmers and historians of pig, and then they had a panel on religion in the pig. And so I was on that panel, and then one of my colleagues there said, oh, that's great, I'm doing something on animals and law. And so I got invited to a conference at Harvard Law School on animals and law. And then another colleague said, oh, you work on animals and law, so would you give a paper for this animals and law in the ancient world? And so all along the way, I've kind of ended up writing a couple papers here and there for that. And this is a paper I'm going to be giving at this Animals and Law conference. When I proposed this talk, I said, oh, I have to work on that this summer. I'll talk about this. And I gave an idea for a title that sort of encompassed where I thought things would go. And this is still very much covers what I'm talking about. But as you'll see, I ended up spending a lot of time talking about particular problematic texts that many people have written about. And I expected to write about this text and move on and talk about other texts. But what I realized that what I thought was going to be the end part of my paper became the beginning. And this text that people have written about a lot, I realized I'm going to argue they write about it completely wrong. So when I read my talk, it's sort of, this is also this went in a very different direction, so please call me out on it if it doesn't work. But I mean, this happens to all of us, right? You start working on one thing and you go somewhere else. Okay, so now I'll read out my talk. Critical animal studies troubles the binary between human and non-human animals, exploring how reconsideration of these strict binaries deprivileges humanness and how such reorientation affects the ethics and representation of both human and non-human animals. That's one of the big things, is talk about animals as non-human animals, to situate humans as human animals. Recently, scholars have begun to consider how insights from critical animal studies might inform their reading of rabbinic literature. This talk contributes to this trend by focusing on how the ancient rabbis used human and non-human animals to interrogate and delineate the boundaries between certain legal categories. My aim is not to offer an exhaustive catalog, but rather to preliminarily investigate some of the fascinating ways that for the rabbis, animals are good to think with. More specifically, I focus on a few of the many instances in which inquiry into animals are used to dehumanize certain human animals. From a modern perspective, these texts, as we shall see, are often difficult to digest, as they depict non-Jews as less than human. Seeking neither to critique nor apologize for these texts, I simply state that this discomfort is intentional, as comparing the human other to the non-human serves by discursive design to erase the important cultural distinction between their humanity and their animality. Discussing the discursive distinction, this discursive function, Beth Berkowitz in a recent book notes, the rabbinic other, and I'm going to have a lot of my text up here, the rabbinic other is the more obvious category with which to be considering animals. Others become such by being compared to animals. Others associate with the wrong animals. Others relate to animals in ways that they shouldn't. It is hard to even imagine the other without the animal, who is the other par excellence. While critical animal studies may reevaluate the crisp binary between human and non-human animals, the ancient rabbis clearly utilized this binary to remove certain people from the category of us and place them firmly across the border in the territory of them. The first section I call What Are Dolphins? Human, Non-Human Animals, and Rabbinic Categorization. The move to dehumanize certain human animals relies on broader rabbinic presumptions about categorization. Everything, be it object, animal, location, time, belongs to a legal category. This is something I talked a little bit about last night. and to which various specific rules apply. The rabbis devote significant energy to considering interstitial people, periods, places, property, etc., in order to decide into which category to place them. Hybrid animals are one such area of concern. For example, Mishnah Bechorot 1:2 inquires, if pure, non-human animal gave birth to what appears to be an impure non-human animal, is that offspring kosher for ingestion? So if an pure gives birth to impure, is it kosher? Working through the many variables that the scenario presents, Tosefta Bechorot 1:10-11, I'm not going to give you all these texts, I'm going to focus just instead on a few, notes that different species have different gestational periods. For example, it asserts that the pig gives birth after 60 days. Now, this is not necessarily biologically true, but for their purposes it is religiously true, right? Truth with a capital T, not fact. Whereas the ape gives birth after 3 years. That sounds like a really long period to be pregnant, but Rachel Neese argues that, quote, this conspicuous display of knowledge about modes of reproduction and gestational periods of a variety of creatures serves as a justifying explanation for why interbreeding is not actually impossible, end quote. While most of this passage works for Neese's larger argument, there is one statement that doesn't quite fit. Here we start with our first text. According to Tosefta Bechorot 1:11, dolphins give birth and grow offspring like humans. What does it mean that dolphins gestate like humans? Hebrew Adam. The Babylonian Talmud considers this very question. Our rabbis taught in a Braita is a source quoted in a later Rabbinic text that claims to be an earlier source, so it may or may not be earlier. Sometimes they're spurious ones, they create earlier sources. Sometimes they are quoting an earlier source. We'll get to that in a minute. So our rabbis taught in the Braita, dolphins are fruitful and multiply like humans. What are dolphins? Said Rav Yehuda, humans of the sea. Immediately we notice that the version of this tradition quoted here has an important difference in wording. Rather than dolphins giving birth and growing like humans, dolphins are explicitly described as reproducing like humans. I render the Hebrew text here more literally to further highlight this fact. Now, the wording fruitful and multiply, as I'm sure my biblical colleague noticed, is the Hebrew panim veravin, cues an association with Genesis 1:28. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, pru or vu in Hebrew, fill the earth and master it. Rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and all the living things that creep on the earth. In Genesis 1:28, God commands the primordial man and woman to reproduce and rule over the earth in a manner that reflects a rigid, hierarchical binary between human and non-human animals. By invoking this language, not only are dolphins engaging in a human reproductive activity, but the audience is expected to know the second part of this verse, which could be read as implying that dolphins are now ruling over birds in the sky, the living creatures of the earth, and even over all other fishes in the sea. This realization sparks the anonymous voice of the Talmud, we're returning to that text, to inquire, what are dolphins? Before answering this question, it is worth pausing to consider an important variant. Medieval commentator Rashi, writing in medieval France, has a version of this text that states, dolphins are fruitful and multiply from humans. The difference between like humans and from humans in Hebrew is a single orthographically similar Hebrew letter, Kaf and Mem respectively. Whether this variant was known to the editors of the Talmud, the logic of this grammar supports Rav Yehuda's assertion that dolphins are b'nei yama, which literally means in Aramaic, sons of the sea, but which I render humans of the sea. Dolphins are thus aquatic mammals that at the very least share some special similarities with humans and at most engage in procreative sex with humans. As odd as it might seem, the notion of human-dolphin intercourse is actually quite a common motif appearing both in the ancient Mediterranean and well beyond. There's a footnote that there's a lot of scholarship on this. Craig Williams has a famous article that talks about lots of Greek and Roman text about humans having sex with dolphins. I did not expect to be researching a bunch of that this summer, but it's actually a fairly well-researched subject matter. Rashi himself was aware of this motif, which he incorporates into his own commentary on this passage, noting, quote, humans of the sea. There are fish in the sea that are half the form of a man and half the form of fish, and in French they are called, I'm really bad at pronouncing French, so I apologize, sirene, an old French word derived from the Latin siren. So an old French word is my little addition to it. So when he quotes that verse, he says, oh, there's a common thing, it's half man, half. That's why some people often translate this term mermaid, but in the Hebrew it's very explicitly dolphin. Yet the ambiguity still remains. Are dolphins like humans or from humans? And in either case, how precisely are they legally categorized? Rather than answer these questions, I use them to point towards a larger issue. Again, in the words of Beth Berkowitz, quote, animals serve frequently in rabbinic literature to define the limits of reality. Animals sit at the edge of personhood, like a variety of human characters, women, children, slaves, foreigners, end quote. To define what it means to be the dolphin or any other non-human animal is to define what it means to be human. It can also serve to define what it means for a human animal to lose their status as a human. It is to this conversation that we turn in the next section, which I call defining the human. For the rabbis, a human animal is capable of agency. That is, the ability to act with intention and efficacy. Often, however, this legal concept of agency only applies to Jewish human animals. In limiting agency, the non-Jew regularly is equated with a non-human animal. In this section, we will examine two instances in which this process results in dehumanizing the non-Jew. This is the section I thought I was going to be talking about mostly in this paper, but it sets up what I'm going to talk about. So the first one is the butcher a human or an ape? Valid rabbinic slaughter requires three things. To be fit or proper, which is the literal translation of kosher. First, the non-human animal that is slaughtered. The slaughtering procedure itself is second. And third, the human animal who is slaughtered. All of those need to be proper according to their categories. While the Hebrew Bible spells out some of these concerns, mostly in regard to that which is slaughter, and much less so in regard to the procedure and the one slaughtering, the rabbis robustly expand the various related issues. It is in this context that we encounter our first text. All may slaughter, and their slaughter is valid, Hebrew kshera, except for a person who is deaf, a person with cognitive impairment, or a minor, lest they ruin the meat in their act of slaughtering. But all of these who slaughter while others observe them, their slaughter is valid. An animal slaughtered by a Gentile is carcass, nevelah in Hebrew, and it imparts impurity by carriage. If you carry it, it will impart impurity. One who slaughters at night, and so to a blind person who slaughters, his slaughter is valid. One who slaughters on the Sabbath or on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, even though he becomes liable for death, his slaughter is valid. While all may slaughter, and their slaughter is valid, the next word defines the remainder of this text, except. In typical rabbinic fashion, a broad statement is made and then immediately exceptions are introduced. For example, we learn that all refers to all adults who are neither hearing nor cognitively impaired. We learn that one who slaughters on the Sabbath or on Yom Kippur, actions which are punishable by death, still produces valid animal slaughter. And as we shall discuss in more detail, we learn that all refers only to Jews. Tucked into this passage is a provocative claim. An animal slaughtered by a Gentile is carcass. Carcass, in Hebrew nevelah, refers to an animal that has died a natural death. In addition to its purity implications, as the passage mentions, carcass transmits impurity to anyone who carries it. It is important to note that the category of death is not at the hands of a human or non-human animal. It is just a natural death. Further, as I have argued elsewhere, the Tannaic innovation that an animal slaughtered by a non-Jew is not fit for Jewish consumption simply because it is slaughtered by a non-Jew is introduced without justification and, as it would seem, without controversy. This is incredibly innovative. We have no discussion of that prior to this, but it's just presented as if it's not that interesting. Taken together, then, this passage states that slaughter by a non-Jew has the same legal effect as that of a non-human animal dying from natural causes. Slaughter by a non-Jew, therefore, is not deemed equivalent to an action performed by a human animal. But does this fully dehumanize a non-Jew? After all, their slaughter is simply deemed a natural causes. This ambiguity is clarified in a text edited shortly after our previous one. It is, all are fit to slaughter, even a Samaritan, even an uncircumcised man, and even a Jewish apostate. An animal slaughtered by a heretic is regarded as an act of idolatry. An animal slaughtered by a Gentile, in that case, it is invalid. And an animal slaughtered by an ape, in that case, it is invalid. As it is said, you may slaughter and you may eat, with emphasis added, according to Deuteronomy 12:21. You may eat that which a Gentile has slaughtered, and you may not eat that which an ape has slaughtered, and you may not eat that which is slaughtered by his own action. We begin by clarifying that all, meaning all Jews, are fit to slaughter, including three categories of people who might be classified as Jewish. We then learn that slaughter by a Jewish heretic, in Hebrew min, is regarded as an idolatrous sacrifice. This is the first pivot point of my argument. Unlike the previous categories of those who are Jewish, the heretic is deemed outside the boundaries of Judaism. But the heretic is still technically Jewish. So their slaughter must count for something, and hence it is classified as idolatrous. After establishing that slaughter of the heretic is idolatrous, and idolatrous being the polar opposite of proper rabbinic ritual practice, we turn our attention to the second pivot point of this text. Slaughter by Gentiles and slaughter by apes are equated, both resulting in invalid slaughter. Elsewhere, I have argued that butchery, a cultural practice that separates humans from animals, is now marked by the Tanaim, that first group of rabbis responsible for Mishnah and Tosefta, these texts we just quoted, as distinctively Jewish practices. Gentile slaughter is pejoratively, it would seem, equated with slaughter of an ape. Unlike the heretic whose slaughter is recognized as actually occurring and hence is pejoratively branded as idolatrous, the Gentile slaughter is likened to an action of an animal. It is a natural, not a human act. The exclusion of Gentiles from the human cultural practice of butchery is furthered by the inclusion of a biblical reference. The full verse of Deuteronomy 12:21, with emphasis added, states, "If the place where the Lord has chosen to establish his name is too far from you, you may slaughter from your cattle and your sheep that the Lord gave you, as I have commanded you, and you may eat to your heart's content in your settlements." Our text assumes that the implicit you in this text is a normative rabbinic Jew. You may eat only that which you have slaughtered. Their slaughter is invalid for ingestion by you. And not only that, the three categories of them, with a capital T, are equated in a way that marks each as the product of non-human action. Gentile slaughter, ape slaughter, and carcass. In sum, slaughter by a Gentile is deemed at best a non-human action, and at worst the action of a non-human animal. In establishing this legal principle, the Gentile is dehumanized while concomitantly the Jew becomes the normative human animal. The next section is like cattle pens on the Sabbath. Last night at the talk, the concept of the Eruv came up, and I said I was going to talk about it today, so now I will. Another manner in which the legal agency of non-Jews is limited via equivalence with non-human animals appears amidst a discussion of the Eruv, literally meaning mixture. And if you don't know what this is, there's a great Daily Show clip on the Eruv, which you can just Google Daily Show Eruv, and laughter will ensue. But wait till after the talk, but I suggest it highly. Literally meaning mixture, an Eruv is a legal fiction by which multiple domains can be mixed, allowing for the carrying of objects between what would otherwise be separate domains, an action prohibited on the Sabbath. So you cannot carry objects on the Sabbath from one domain, so your house, to someone else's. But an Eruv is a way, through various ways today, often it's a piece of string, that is continuously around a section of property, so that means one house and another house, if they're within that domain, now are considered a single domain, so you can carry from one house to another. Amidst detailed exposition of this rabbinic principle, conversation turned towards a particular type of Eruv, one that merges households that share a courtyard. This was a common thing in the ancient world. At college campuses, I think it works quite well too, is imagine a whole bunch of dorms surrounding in a quad with grass in between. Can you carry something from one dorm to another on the Sabbath? And the question is, it depends on if the Eruv laws apply or not. Without the creation of such an Eruv, residents of each household could not carry objects outside of their homes on the Sabbath without violating rabbinic law. In Mishnah Eruvin 6.1, and the tractate Eruvin talks about Eruvs, the shared courtyard of a Jew and a non-Jew is introduced, and when we learn, if a Jew lives with a non-Jew in a courtyard, or with one who does not agree with the Eruv, in that case, that person imposes a prohibition against carrying on the Sabbath on him, equally meaning the Jew. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, he never prohibits unless there are two Jews who would prohibit one another. Without getting bogged down too much in the technical details of this Mishnah, it teaches that when a Jew shares a courtyard with either a non-Jew or a presumably non-rabbinic Jew who rejects the rabbinic concept of an Eruv, then the Jew is forbidden to carry anything into their shared courtyard on the Sabbath. Another opinion is offered wherein non-Jews do not prohibit, only Jews matter legally. When we look at how Tosefta, edited shortly after this, treats this topic, a very different narrative emerges. A courtyard of a non-Jew, in that case, it is like a cattle pen, Hebrew kadir shel behema. It is permitted to bring in and take out of the courtyard to the houses surrounding the courtyard, and from the houses to the courtyard, and utensils that are for the Sabbath that are in the courtyard, it is permissible to carry them in the courtyard. But if even a single Jew lives in the courtyard, in that case, it is prohibited to carry on the Sabbath, because it is like his courtyard. The courtyard of a non-Jew is compared to a cattle pen. Right? It's very stark and, I find, troubling. Legally and rhetorically, it is worth unpacking this simile. A cattle pen encloses and contains cattle, that is, explicitly non-human animals. A courtyard shared between non-Jews encloses all of its residents into a single domain. As a single domain, one can bring objects into and out of homes that share that courtyard without violating rabbinic regulations prohibiting carrying on the Sabbath. The same statement applies to cattle pens. Beyond the mere legal point of clarifying Sabbath law, the comparison of non-Jewish courtyards to cattle pens clearly serves to dehumanize them. I think that's pretty hard to argue against. But just in case this rhetorical move is not clear enough, the text continues on to note that even if a single Jew resides in a shared courtyard, then Rabbi Meir's ruling from Mishnah Eruvin 6.1 applies. Now a Jew cannot carry anything on the Sabbath, since it is no longer a single domain, but separate domains. When only non-Jews lived there, it was an undifferentiated cattle pen inhabited by non-Jews, that is, by non-human animals. But now a human animal, a Jew, has moved in, and hence it is deemed equivalent to, I think this wording is really important, his courtyard. In short, the shared courtyard is not deemed a human habitation until a rabbinic human moves in, and according to the rabbis, only Jews are fully human. And this gets to a section defining bestiality. This is a section I did not expect to get into, but I feel that I have a strong argument to make about defining bestiality. So here goes. So thus far I've argued that rabbinic literature dehumanizes the non-Jew. This point has been made by scholars previously, so it is certainly not my own insight. However, an important logical extension of this observation has been continuously missed. Namely, can the dehumanized animal actually engage in what we would call bestiality? By definition, bestiality refers to sexual interaction between human and non-human animals. But if neither animal is actually human, is bestiality the correct nomenclature? In this section, I'm going to argue against using bestiality for describing such sexual interactions. And this is important, as we'll see. There's a text, which I would call as dearer to them than their own lives, that scholars have written tons about whenever they talk about human, non-human relations in rabbinic literature. Everyone talks about this text, but I think everyone fundamentally misses this point. The locus classicus for the connection between non-Jews and bestiality is Bavli Avodah Zarah 22a to 23a. Due to limits of time, we will only discuss a piece of this complex and difficult narrative, which nevertheless serves to illustrate my overall argument. The Talmudic passage opens by quoting Mishnah Avodah Zarah 2.1. They do not place animals in inns, and they meaning normative rabbinic Jews, belonging to non-Jews, because they, the non-Jews, are suspected of mounting. This Mishnah, in Hebrew, this Mishnah asserts that Jews may not stable their non-human animals, at inns owned by non-Jews, out of concern for mounting, i.e. sexual intercourse. The word that I translate as mounting, its most literal meaning, is usually rendered bestiality. Summarizing the standard argument for how the rabbis used the Hebrew root resh bet ayin, Michael Satlow states, quote, "The word is reserved for animal intercourse, intercourse between a human and an animal, and homoerotic intercourse," end quote. Though I do not disagree with the general point about its usage, I argue against understanding this term when applied to non-Jews as bestiality, because such a translation obscures important nuances of the ways in which the other is conceived and articulated in rabbinic literature. And although I won't get into it, he points out this term is also used for homoerotic intercourse, and there's an argument to be made about this as dehumanizing those actions as well. To illustrate my point, we turn to the Talmudic commentary in this Mishnah. What is the reason that they do not leave female animals belonging to Jews alone with female non-Jews? Said Mar Ukva Bar Chama, because non-Jews frequent the wives of their friends, and sometimes when he does not find her, he finds the animal and mounts it. Or if you prefer, say that even if he finds her, meaning his friend's wife, he also mounts the animal belonging to a Jew. As Master said, animals belonging to Jews are dearer to them than their own wives. This text opens by presuming that the reader understands why a Jew would not leave his female and male non-human animals alone with a male non-Jew, or his male non-human animals alone with a female non-Jew. But why would female non-human animals and female non-Jews present any concern? The answer is that non-Jews are perceived to lack self-restraint. They frequently visit their male friends' houses in order to have sexual intercourse with their friends' wives. Not only do they not care about the legal and moral concerns of adultery and the lack of moderation, these are important rabbinic concerns in these instances, but they are depicted as animalistic in their desires. While the rabbinic ideal, that is a male and Jewish humans, are engaged in self-restraint, non-Jewish men are depicted as being so driven by their passions that they will regularly have sex with their friends' wives. And if their friends' wives are not home, then they will have sex with any available female non-human animal. This is a very troubling text, which is why so many people have written about it, because you have to grapple with this. This dehumanizing rhetoric is kicked up a notch when the text continues on to declare that even if non-Jews find their friends' wives at home, they would much rather engage in sexual activity with a non-human animal belonging to a Jew. Master's statements make this presumption crystal clear. Animals belonging to Jews are dearer to them than their own wives. For this reason, Jews may not leave their female non-human animals alone, even with female non-Jews. Though scholars describe this sexual activity as bestiality, I argue that the rhetoric of dehumanizing the non-Jew is not fully taken into account. Jews cannot leave their non-human animals alone with non-Jews precisely because, unlike Jews, non-Jews cannot be expected to act as human animals are expected to. That, again, this is not me claiming, this is a rabbinic assumption. Not only do they engage in unbridled sexual activity, but their men actually prefer to have sex with Jewish non-human animals. In this rhetoric, non-Jewish men are dehumanized. Thus, their sexual activity should be interpreted as the sexual activity between two non-human animals. Hence, it is mounting, not bestiality. We continue arguing this in a section I call Beautiful Donkey. Thus far, I've attended to how non-Jewish men are dehumanized. Other non-normative human animals are dehumanized as well. Women, slaves, minors, those with disabilities, etc. However, the visual eros of rabbinic texts focuses on the male gaze, a distorted lens that we must refocus. In this section, I briefly use two passages about donkeys to show how dehumanized non-Jewish and non-normative bodies trouble the binary of bestiality. In the first passage, a famous rabbi gazes at beautiful non-Jewish women. One who sees beautiful trees or beautiful human beings, in Hebrew B'nai Adam, says, "Blessed is the one who created such beautiful creatures in his world." Once upon a time, Rabban Gamliel saw a beautiful non-Jewish woman, and he recited the blessing over her. Did not Rabbi Zera say in the name of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, and Rabbi Ba say that Rabbi Chia said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? It's a long chain of tradition of who they're trying to attribute to who they understand it to be originally said. You shall not show them no mercy. I think you shall show them no mercy. I think that's a typo. Deuteronomy 7:2, which teaches that you shall not grant them favor. What did he say? He did not say unbewitched. He said, only who created such beautiful creatures in his world, because even if one saw a beautiful camel, beautiful horse, or a beautiful donkey, one says, blessed is the one who created beautiful creatures in his world. Well, I do not have time to comment fully on this rich text. It opens by teaching a general blessing to recite when one encounters a beautiful tree or human animal created by God. It then introduces a story about Rabban Gamliel gazing at a non-Jewish woman, over whom he recited this blessing. How could he have done this, the text asks, especially given biblical prescriptions against saying anything nice about non-Jews? Clarifying the concern that Rabban Gamliel had actually wished that no harm come behind her, this is the meaning of unbewitched, we are told that he merely recited the blessing that one says when one encounters beautiful creatures that God creates, such as beautiful camels, horses, or donkeys. But notice two subtle discursive moves made in this text. First, the original blessing is recited by one who sees beautiful trees or a beautiful human being or beautiful human beings. It does not refer to non-human animals. Second, in addition to including beautiful non-human animals in this blessing, the non-Jewish woman is compared to non-human animals. The normative rabbinic male gaze, gazing at a non-Jewish woman is therefore compared to a human animal gazing at a non-human animal. Were they to engage in sexual activity, bestiality would be the proper term to describe their action. In the second passage, we learn about the four things that God hates, and the fourth of which is one who has sexual intercourse in front of any living creatures, in Hebrew chai. Commenting on what this means, the following exchange appears. Rav Yehuda said to Shmuel, even in front of mice? Shmuel said to him, wise guy. This is Daniel Byron's translation. It could be lots of things. I like the wise guy because it gets the the gist. Wise guy, no. For example, this refers to the house of so-and-so, which has sexual intercourse in front of their male and female slaves. And as for them, on what biblical basis do they justify their actions of having sex in front of their slaves? You stay here with the donkey, Genesis 22:5, which teaches that slaves are people that are similar to the donkey. God hates those who engage in sexual intercourse in the presence of any living creature. Rav Yehuda asked Shmuel if this refers to having sex even when mice are present, i.e. small creatures that might hide in the corner and are not easy to detect. Shmuel rejects this view emphatically. Rather, he argues, it refers to the house of so-and-so, which is the rabbinic term for John Doe, where they have sex in front of their male and female slaves. The text inquires, on what biblical basis does so-and-so justify this action? What reason do they say they can do this? Well, on Genesis 22:5, which mentions a donkey. And how does that justify this sexual exhibition? Because, according to the text, slaves are people that are similar to the donkey. So it equates slaves with the donkey, and then it says this verse allows that. The exact mechanism of this exegesis need not detain us. What matters is that slaves are dehumanized. They are donkeys. Human animals, i.e. rabbinic Jews, should not be having sex in front of their slaves, who are deemed biblically equivalent to non-human animals. In this action, it is this action that God is described as hating. When a similar exegesis of Genesis 22:5 appears elsewhere in the Babylonian Talmud, the text clearly references Canaanite slaves, that is, non-Jewish slaves, as the rabbis would understand them, and it refers to those Canaanite slaves as the donkey. I believe that the same understanding underlies our present text as well, meaning that the slaves are doubly dehumanized, as being both slave and non-Jew. But remove the donkey from the bedroom, and then normative sex may occur without God hating anything. When their slaughter is equated with that of an ape, or their courtyard are equated with cattle pens, non-Jews are dehumanized. In the binary human, non-human animal, non-Jews become legally equivalent to non-human animals. As a result, when rabbinic texts depict non-Jews as engaged in sexual activity with non-human animals, it should not be deemed bestiality. On the other hand, since a Jew can engage in bestiality, when they gaze at a non-Jews in a sexual manner, then the language of bestiality is appropriate. And there's actually lots of more discussions that involve comparisons of donkeys, and when they're talking about male rabbis and female non-Jews having sex. And I think all of those should maybe be read through this language of bestiality, perhaps. For this reason, they refer to their non-Jewish slaves who watch them fornicate as the donkey, and they bless God for creating beautiful donkeys. Writing this talk, I often had to grapple with how deeply troubling many of these texts are to my modern values. I conclude by noting this discomfort, not to distance myself from these texts, but to remind my audience that this unease is integral to them. They are intended strategically and discursively to depict the non-Jew as non-human. And this rhetoric of dehumanization is, by its very design, troubling and, dare I say, animalistic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jordan, and that really gave a lot to think about. We have about 15 minutes for comments, questions, thoughts.
Is it possible for you to contextualize these texts in any more specific way? Because is it possible that this comes from a more particular time and place, rather than just the 500 to 700 years, where this sort of animus can be explained by sort of more particular historical encounters?
So I'm talking about rabbinic texts, but if you can broaden it out for, you can find this in biblical and second temple texts, you can find this in Greek and Roman texts, you can find this in medieval and, you can look at modern political discourse and see how rhetoric dehumanizes the other and then uses that. So, and that's where critical animal studies has sort of been working on that broadly. So the practice of doing so is not exceptional. But many people hadn't really taken those insights and thought about these texts. So, for example, the text I mainly ended up talking about bestiality, everyone just talked about, oh, look, it's dehumanizing, and didn't think through all the full repercussions of it. So I'd say, yes, you can find tons of examples in other Jewish contexts, in other non-Jewish contexts, both contemporary and cross-culturally. But what critical animal studies is starting to do is force people to grapple with the full implications of those statements. And I think some fields have been quicker to adopt it than others. Does that get to what you're asking? Yeah. You can push back now.
I'm asking more specifically about this animus towards Gentiles, whatever that meant for these Jews.
Yes.
Right? So is this something equivalent to the Amalekites, or is there a particular hostility at a moment and place that helps to explain, even though as it goes forward, that could be forgotten and this could become a sort of abstract idea? Do you have any idea what would have instigated this sort of?
I think you see this, it's hard to reduce it to a single thing. What I would say is that some texts it's just this general dehumanizing the other, and sometimes it's very specific. So when I think of the examples that come more to mind are pig examples, for example. So rabbis will talk about the Rome is embodied in the pig, because they say Romans love pig, and it happens that the Legio Tempetensis, the Roman legion, that destroys the second temple in 70 CE, their symbol is the boar, right? So it's all set for that. And they say, well, Rome is embodied to the pig. Pigs look kosher outside, they have split hooves. But if you look inside them, they don't chew the cud, and so therefore they're corrupt to the core. They say Rome has these law courts, so they look just. But if you go look in their law courts, they're utterly corrupt. So they're pretending to be kosher, right? So they look at that and see, and there's another text of Rabbi Akiva's offered the opportunity to have sex with two of the most beautiful Roman women. And he's left alone in a room, and he spends all night, well, one says, turn towards me, and he turns and spits. And the other says, turn towards me, and he spits. And the next day, Roman general says, why did you do that? Why didn't you do, the text says, what men usually do? And he says, well, they smell like pig. And his idea is their body, in fact, there's even a pun, because the Hebrew for turn is chazor, which is the same thing as chazir, which means pig. So he was literally here and saying, you could either say pig towards me, or you could even use an English vulgarism, and he was hearing them say pork me, right? A pun on have sex and pig. But that is an intentional valence there. So and that is exemplifying that. So you see that in some texts, but others it's just a generic dehumanization of the other. So I would say you see different things, and then you see that deployed in different times and places where they'll pick up on one or the other. Does that get to?
Yeah, absolutely.
So like, I don't think the error of text comes from a particular animus of a specific, more generic animus, but there are others that I think are very particular. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about how gender weaves into this? Because one of the things, I mean, I am really ignorant of this. All of the discussion of who can slaughter and who can't, is it just assumed that women would never slaughter, or are they, where do they come in? Are they like minors? So that's in one place. And then there's all of the stuff around sexual intercourse and who's responsible for it. So could you just...
So yeah, that's a really big question. So in general, the rabbis assume the normative view is a male, free, adult, elite, rabbinic Jew. So they'll talk about, and Hebrew is a gendered language, and Aramaic is too, so everything will have to have a male or a female grammatical gender. And so sometimes when they're talking about in male gender, they're talking just generically, and sometimes they very clearly have. And usually they mean male. When it comes to slaughter, there's women are permitted to slaughter, do all those things. So that doesn't seem to be, they imagine the slaughter as male, but women could slaughter. But they do talk often about what is included, what is not. And when they do that, they often turn to female slaves, minors, because they assume, of course, free adult men could. So then they ask, well, can women? And that's when gender enters. Now, with sex, they're talking, the visual gaze is very clearly male. And so they're talking about this in terms of men. So, for example, they're worried about your female animals with female non-Jews, because they presume male animals with female non-Jews, sex would occur. Male non-Jews with female animals, sex would occur. But notice they don't imagine that female animals with female non-Jews, sex would occur. Like, they don't think of that as a possibility, which of course is precluding. If they were equal opportunity, right, judging that, then that would, it's like, what are they not thinking about, right? There's a common thing that the rabbis don't know what to do, for example, with female homoerotic relationships, because they imagine they look at biblical text, man shall not lie down with another man, and they imagine that as penetrative sex, and so then they don't know what about women, because for them, sex is then an act of penetration. And so they then talk about it in terms of women rubbing together, and they're like, well, it's not penetration, so you can't, like, so they see them struggling with it, but that's the first time they think about it, but they're so bound by heteroerotic models that they either don't think about it or can't fully think through the implications. And then when it comes to these, I do see heavily gendered things. Who are they gazing at? They're imagining the men wanting to have sex with women, and then they're imagining, and that has implications for the bestiality, and then for them, right, they're imagining their gaze, and you have rabbis gazing at non-Jewish women. They're not gazing at beautiful non-Jewish men, right? So there's a tremendously gendered component of it. And it's sort of another thing I found in addition to the Dolphin section is how often they talk about there's a few other instances where they imagine sex and describe women as donkeys, and they use that to work through these issues. And they're talking about women as donkeys, and they're talking about men. They're very clearly gendering these components, and they're only writing about it from a particular male heteroerotic viewpoint. Is this answering? Yeah.
I guess my ultimate question is, how does gender function in this question of the human and the not human? And that last example that you gave of women as donkeys on the one hand, and women is allowed to do certain kinds of rituals.
Right. Well, also more broadly, the rabbis are influenced by broader Greek and Roman notions that the height of humanity is the rational male. And women are uncontrolled by their passions. So a man who's uncontrolled by his passions is emasculated and effeminized. And that's bad. And you get this, for example, an interesting element that early Christianity brings in, right, is the idea that women can renounce their sexuality, but then they act like men, right? There's no, a woman who's acting rationally is not a woman reaching the ideal of womanhood. It's a woman who's acting like a man, right? So there's no, so that category is a problem that early Christianity has to grapple with. But for the rabbis, they're also influenced by Greek and Roman notions. So even a woman acting that way is not, there's no category for that, because that ultimately is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And again, I'm not espousing, I'm just, yes.
In your work with like early rabbinic texts,
Yeah.
kind of around this issue, have you encountered any that seem like they're trying to almost like recuperate the humanity of the other, or like challenge the animalization of the other, or does it seem pretty unitarily this?
So I've only begun work on this, but they really are in that, because the main project seems to be, because the main project in the end is, for these texts are sort of formulating and selling and marketing the rabbinic system. And the rabbinic system is imagining this as the best system, the most rational in that sense, and authorized by God in their understandings of everything. And so for them, they're pushing back against lots of other non-rabbinic Jews. Rabbis, in retrospect, seem like they're authoritative and dominant, but I mean, in the very first rabbinic documents, there are at most 100 people mentioned. And although it's hard to figure out demographics, there were a lot more than 100 Jews at that time in those 100 places. And so pretty uniformly, there's the best you can look for is a benign looking down on the other. But there's no move that I am aware of to move the other firmly into the category of human animal. Now they might say be against fully, some texts might be less about mistreating that, but on the other hand, it's, it's like, you can love your dog but not treat your dog like a human, right? So I think, and that's in some ways a bad example, in some ways a very good example for that. So yes, maybe I'm working on more systematic reference, but I can think of no single example where they actively work against a dehumanizing of the other, and that seems pretty consistent. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
It's your hand.
Yeah. So that brings up something I was thinking about in regards to the Greek material, in which we see, again, this very clear dehumanizing of certain people groups, especially what the Greeks deemed barbarians, and comparing them to animals. But then we also see the very, it seems strange at first glance, phenomenon of the Greeks humanizing certain groups of animals as being proper Greeks. And it's oftentimes unexpected groups like shorebirds or ants or things like that. And so I'm wondering, is the material that you've seen totally pejorative, or is there this same porous boundary between animal and human, or non-human animal and human animal, in that some non-human animals are elevated to the status of personhood?
So I would say it's pretty much all pejorative, except when they're talking about actions of animals that they see as personifying human virtues and things, but they're not necessarily using that to look at the animal and say, now we should elevate that animal. They look at it to, like, they acknowledge that the pig biologically, the anathema, the total opposite, the embodiment of the other, has a lot of biological things that are similar to humans, right? So they acknowledge that, but they might talk about things that animals do. Sometimes they'll talk about the bad characteristic of animals. Sometimes they'll say, oh, look, these animals are better than others because of how they act. But they're thinking that in terms of personifying human action. They're not thinking about it as elevating that animal beyond being an animal. So, I don't know, that gets to that.
No, that does. Thank you.
You mentioned the usefulness of these categorizations for modern political discourse. Could you say just a bit more about that, please?
So I avoid modernity.
It's not particularly desirable.
I don't have to do IRB, right? People I study die about, the latest about 1,500 years ago. I can't complain about my work. But I would say that it's very hard to not look at the world around and see the dehumanizing rhetoric of the other, and that often use an animalistic, you know, this group are a bunch of animals, for example. You'll find statements like that by politicians, right? And that is clearly using that rhetoric to dehumanize the others. And so I'd say the thing that I would want to say is, instead of taking a stance one way or the other politically, is what critical animal studies that I'm trying to apply to rabbinic texts, as it applied to a modern context, is to look at the ways that these categories are used discursively and strategically. To imagine, the reason I say human animal and non-human animal is to put them all in a continuity of animals. And what separates an animal from a non-human animal? We used language choices, right? In German, Essen, Fressen, right? You know, to imagine yourself as hungry like a wolf, right, is beyond human hunger. He acted like an animal, right, is a way of, becomes a code for this person acted beyond the boundaries of what I consider human. And by comparing them to an animal, I'm saying that they don't act, I'm elevating myself and de-elevating them, and I'm making it ontologically, constitutionally embodied difference. And you see a lot of that happening today. And my goal, again, is not to make a modern political statement, but to say it's important to analyze this rhetoric, to see how that's being used to make larger arguments. Is that enough of a dodge, but enough of an answer? So good.
Actually, Nathan
Oh,
has
sorry,
signed up
Nathan.
for it.
Thank you. I want to circle back to Amy's question about gender,
Okay.
and also the question about porous categories.
Okay.
And also your talk last night.
Okay.
So I am.
So it's the standard one question,
Yeah.
15 parts.
So I'm remembering imperfectly Talmudic text about women drinking,
Yes.
where as they drink more, their category shifts. I can't remember.
Yes, and the fourth
grade,
example is.
she will have sex with a donkey. So what category is the woman in at that point? Is it, I'm really freaking out by that picture right now.
Oh, sorry, that's my son.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna, this is a talk I gave.
Yeah, so what category is she in at that point? Is it bestiality? Is the problem that she moves through categories? What's going on here?
Here, it is taught right to 1 cup of wine is beneficial for a woman, 2 cups is a disgrace, 3 cups lead her to making explicit sexual propositions, 4 cups leads to her making sexual propositions, even to a donkey in the marketplace, since she's so drunk that she does not care with whom she has sex. Rava said this was taught only when her husband is not with her. This comes up in the case of a husband lives abroad and he's maintaining his wife through an intermediary, so he's not present. Said, but if he's with her, she can drink whatever she wants because we have no problem. So continue.
So what is this doing with categories?
Right.
By the time she's got the 4th cup, what category is she in? Is
Right.
it bestiality?
Okay, this is a great question. So, as I said, there's a lot more to talk about donkeys, and this is one of them. So this is my other talk is about drinking, so I end up thinking about this in all multiple ways. But in this context, let's go back to what I said about men are capable of self-restraint. Women are not, in Rabbinic and Greek and Roman context. Women can't control themselves. Men need to help them control themselves. And one of my favorite other Rabbinic texts that exemplify this, they say, a man should not be left alone with a woman, because a woman will basically, they imagine that sexually assault him and he can't stop. It's a very different conception of things. So they say a man should always then have a male friend with him to prevent that. But that's only in the city. If they're going to go in the country, he needs 2 other friends with him. Because one of them has to take a bathroom break. If you only have 2, one break, you're now left alone. So you need to have 2 friends with you. So no matter what, you always have a buddy. Otherwise, the woman will immediately, that's a very different understanding of that. In this concept, again, it's saying alcohol leads to lowering of inhibitions. And remember, in this context, this woman is, her husband, this is specifically a married woman, whose husband is away and needs to use an intermediary to basically give his wife her weekly allowance. So he's not physically present. And so it then says, if she drinks 1 cup of wine, okay, because wine was a sort of standard beverage, you drank it watered down, everyone drank wine, kids, adults, 1 cup of wine was a normal drink with dinner. But 2 leads to disgrace. Now she's starting to lose her inhibitions. 3 leads to making explicit sexual propositions. By the way, this text is very much, again, focused on the male gaze. They talk all about this. There's no similar text to this for men. They talk about men not getting drunk. There's another text that says, and this is, I'm not making a modern political statement, but it's very relevant to things. There's a text that says, a man who drinks too much is invalid to serve as a judge. And it begins with wine enters intelligence departs. So let's speak very broadly, but this level of specificity is only for women. 3 cups leads her to making 6 explicit propositions. I think this is important. First, it's explicit sexual propositions. The assumption is to human animals. She's drunk, she wants to have sex with humans. At 4 cups, she's now not only not rational, but she's now become so drunk and irrational that she's devolved. So yes, this is a losing of her humanity because she's having sex with a donkey. In that case, it would be bestiality because she's still a human, but she's a human that's acting like that. But they don't talk about men having sex. They don't do this with men. The other example I could bring of donkey is there's a text about magic, which is, there's a text, the assumption is that women are magicians, and so men should watch out for them. And particularly they should watch out is, if you ever drink an even number of drinks, you're susceptible to magic. If you drink an odd number of drinks, you're okay. One of my favorite texts of this is, there was a rabbi whose mother would hang out with him in the bar, and she'd always have 2 drinks with him, so she'd always put one in, so she'd keep track of him, so he could drink with his buddies, and his mom's standing right there. So, oh, honey, you only had 2 drinks here, how many go? Right, but that's the level there. Now there's a whole gender component of that, right? So there's a rabbi who orders a drink, and he notices the female bartender mumbling under her breath. Now mumbling, beyond just rabbinic texts and Greek and Roman texts, mumbling women are seen as casting spells. So she's mumbling. So he pours a little bit of the water out, and I think it's scorpions. Now, I'm not that kind of doctor, but I'm sure drinking scorpions is bad for your health, right? So he says, I drink of yours, you drink of mine. So he now casts a magic spell. She drinks it, and guess what she turns into? A donkey. He then rides her into the marketplace. Her girlfriend realizes this, mumbles another spell. She transforms into this non-Jewish woman, back into it. And so he is, and the text just ends with, and he is seen riding a woman in the marketplace. I think the sexual connotations there are very obvious, but I think, again, the donkeyness there is, he is a male Jew, she is a female non-Jew, therefore they're imagining, casting it in terms of bestiality. So does that answer? I'm glad you asked a question about a text that I just immediately had the PowerPoint for, because I talked about this last week, so yeah.
I assume that the last one, when her
Which
husband is with her, then we have no problem. It means that she takes 4 cups or the 5 or 6.
The reason that Rava's thing is because we've been imagining a scenario of a husband away. So when a husband's out of town, and again the whole scenario is a husband out of town maintaining spousal support through an intermediary. But then Rava's saying, no, but if the husband's in town, if she gets drunk, what's the concern if she gets drunk? She will engage in illicit sexuality. But if he's physically home, and she wants to engage in sexuality, she has a rabbinically approved outlet, i.e. her husband. So she can get as drunk as she wants because he is there to intellectually and physically act as a form of self-control, which is gendered problematically, we might say, right? It's very clear that she's unable of controlling herself. It doesn't describe how he would act if he got drunk, and it assumes that if she got drunk, she would only walk. But it very clearly, he's saying, no, this is only in this scenario, but if he was present, those rules don't apply, even though all of those assumptions apply.
But it doesn't mean that he would be okay with her having sex with others.
No, because that would be the biblical and rabbinic definition of adultery is a married woman having sex with someone other than her husband. So he, as long as the person who he had sex with was not married, could engage in that without being adultery, but she could not. But the presumption here is she would then only want to have sex with him. But this is clarifying that would theoretically be, but again, this clarification does not remove any of the gendered and other concerns that we're discussing.
Well, I am having so much fun, as we all are, that I actually hadn't even looked at the clock, and after our time is up, I actually have to go teach Kafka, who was a master of thinking about that complex relationship between Jews and animals. But I want to, so we have the room for a few more minutes, however, so we can continue the conversation. I know some of you had your hands up and wanted to also ask a question, so we're around for a few minutes, but please join me in thanking you.